The automatic doors slid open with a faint whoosh, letting in a gust of cold night air as an elderly black woman stepped into the store. She walked carefully, leaning slightly on her cane, her worn coat wrapped tightly around her frail body. Her silver-streaked hair peeked out from under a knit hat, and despite the exhaustion on her face, her eyes held a quiet strength. The bright fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the tiled floor as she made her way toward the baby aisle. It was late, almost closing time, and the store was mostly empty, except for a few last-minute shoppers. The hum of the overhead speakers played a soft tune, almost drowned out by the beeping of the registers and the occasional rustling of plastic bags. She moved with purpose, scanning the shelves carefully before reaching out and picking up a pack of diapers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the package in her hands, her grip firm but careful. As she turned toward the checkout lanes, she noticed a uniformed officer standing near the self-checkout section, his arms crossed over his chest. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes followed her, sharp and watchful. His name tag read Officer Reynolds. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a clean-shaven face, he carried an air of authority that he clearly enjoyed. His radio crackled faintly on his shoulder, but he ignored it, keeping his gaze locked on the elderly woman. She felt his stare but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the few bills clutched in her hand. Every penny counted, and she had counted this money over and over before leaving the house, making sure she had just enough. As she approached the checkout, the officer suddenly stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Diapers? Didn't think someone your age needed those." A few people nearby turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the officer's words. The old woman paused, her expression unreadable, but she didn't respond. "Or maybe," Officer Reynolds continued, smirking, "you're buying them for a grandchild. A little late for a shopping trip, don't you think?" The tone of his voice made it clear. He wasn't just asking, he was mocking her, making a show of his authority. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken assumptions. Still, the elderly woman remained silent, simply adjusting the diapers under her arm. But the way her fingers tightened around the package, the slight shift in her stance, spoke volumes. She had heard this kind of talk before. A few aisles away, a young cashier stood behind the counter, quietly observing the interaction. His name tag read Marcus. Tall and lean, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, he had been stocking gum and candy when the officer's voice caught his attention. Something about the way the officer spoke, the mocking lilt in his voice, made Marcus's jaw tighten. He knew this woman, and more importantly, he knew something that Officer Reynolds didn't. As the old woman reached the register, the officer's smirk widened. "Hope you're not planning on using any funny money," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The moment hung heavy. Then, before the woman could reply, Marcus stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm as he met the officer's gaze. "You, sure you want to say that to her?" For the first time, Officer Reynolds faltered, confusion flickering across his face. He glanced at Marcus, then back at the woman. Something had shifted. The air had changed, and in that moment, as the store fell into an uneasy silence, it became clear. Officer Reynolds had no idea who he was talking to, but he was about to find out. Officer Reynolds narrowed his eyes at Marcus, clearly not expecting the young cashier to challenge him. The smirk that had been plastered on his face just moments ago wavered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He straightened his shoulders, puffing out his chest slightly, as if to remind everyone in the store who had the authority here. "And who exactly are you, kid?" Reynolds asked, his voice carrying a forced chuckle. Though there was an edge to it now, Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His hands rested on the counter, steady and sure. His gaze, however, remained locked onto the officer's. Unshaken. "I'm just saying," Marcus replied evenly. "Maybe you should think twice before making assumptions." Reynolds let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head. "Assumptions? Look, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I know what I see." He gestured toward the elderly woman, who still stood quietly, watching, her grip on the diaper package firm. "And what I see is a little unusual, an old lady buying baby supplies, wandering in here at night, looking like she barely scraped together the change to pay for it. "Forgive me for wanting to make sure everything's legit." Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly on the counter. He had worked at this store long enough to know exactly what was happening. He had seen it before, the way people like Reynolds threw their weight around, how they rapped. Their words in concern but laced them with something else, something uglier. But what Officer Reynolds didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was who this woman really was. The elderly woman let out a soft sigh, shifting the diapers in her hands as if they had suddenly grown heavier. Her gaze, though calm, held something deep, something worn by time, by experience. She had faced men like Reynolds before, and she knew, perhaps better than anyone, that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. A younger woman standing a few feet away clutched her shopping basket, glancing between Marcus and the officer with wide eyes. A store employee stacking shelves nearby had stopped moving, his hands frozen over a box of canned goods. Even the couple near the refrigerated section had gone quiet, their conversation fading as the tension in the store thickened. And then, without raising her voice, the elderly woman finally spoke. "Son," she said, her voice low but steady, "do you know who I am?" Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Marcus felt the shift immediately, and he could tell Reynolds did too. Reynolds let out another forced chuckle, though there was hesitation in his eyes now. "Am I supposed to?" The woman didn't answer right away. She just watched him, letting the silence stretch between them. For the first time, Officer Reynolds seemed unsure. Marcus, on the other hand, knew exactly who she was. He had grown up hearing her name. His grandmother had spoken about her in hushed tones, full of respect and admiration. His teachers had mentioned her in passing, their voices carrying a hint of reverence. He had seen old photographs, black and white images that told stories, of marches, of resilience, of a woman who had stood firm when others had bent. And yet here she was, standing in a grocery store at night, just another elderly woman trying to make it through her evening. Reynolds cleared his throat, shifting his stance slightly. "Look, lady, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but..." Before he could finish, Marcus spoke again. His voice was even, but there was something firm beneath it. "You should," he said, his eyes never leaving the officer's. Reynolds blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in Marcus's tone. He glanced at the woman again, as if seeing her for the first time. There was something in her expression, something that made his smug confidence falter. The store remained silent. Every single person within earshot was waiting, watching, sensing that something was unfolding that they didn't quite understand yet. The old woman took a slow step forward, her cane tapping lightly against the floor. "You look at me," she said, her voice still soft but unwavering, "and you see what you want to see. Just an old woman out late, buying something she shouldn't have a need for. And that tells me everything I need to know about you." Reynolds clenched his jaw slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He opened his mouth, then closed it again as if debating how to respond. "You don't know me," he muttered almost defensively. The woman gave him a small, almost tired smile. "I know enough." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He knew she wasn't just talking about tonight. She was talking about every night like this, every moment where someone had looked at her, or people like her, and made up their mind before she had even spoken a word. The moment stretched long, the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the store. Reynolds, for all his bravado, looked less sure of himself now. His usual authority, the thing he carried so easily, suddenly felt less steady in his grip. And then, before anyone could say anything else, the door to the store slid open again, with a soft chime. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding without him having to say a word. He wasn't in a uniform, but something about him made it clear that he was someone important. His sharp eyes swept the store, landing immediately on the elderly woman. The moment he saw her, his entire expression changed. Reynolds noticed too. His brows furrowed slightly as he glanced between the man and the woman, as if trying to piece something together. Marcus, on the other hand, already understood, and as the man took another step forward, the weight of what was about to happen settled over all of them, because Officer Reynolds was about to realize exactly who he had been speaking to, and it was too late to take anything back. The man who had just walked in had a presence that filled the room. He wasn't loud, nor did he move with any exaggerated authority, but there was something about him that commanded attention. His eyes, sharp and observant, took in the situation. In an instant, the elderly woman standing firm, the young cashier tense behind the counter, and Officer Reynolds looking unsettled in a way that hadn't been there before. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiffening. The man wasn't in a uniform, but there was something familiar about him, something that made Reynolds hesitate. The store had been filled with quiet murmurs, the weight of curiosity hanging in the air, but now the silence was absolute. The elderly woman met the man's gaze, and for the first time that night, her expression softened just a little. There was recognition there, something unspoken but deeply understood between them. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. "Is there a problem here?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "No problem, just making sure everything's in order." The man let that hang in the air for a moment, as if letting Reynolds hear how hollow the words sounded outside his own head. Then slowly he turned to the woman. "Are you all right, ma'am?" She gave a small nod. "I've been through worse." Marcus, still standing behind the counter, exhaled quietly, though his body remained tense. He had heard the way she said it, the layers behind those words. This wasn't just about tonight. The young woman with the shopping basket glanced at the man who had just entered, then back at the elderly woman. Something in her eyes flickered with recognition, though she stayed quiet, watching. Reynolds, however, was still trying to regain control of the situation. "Look," he said, his tone shifting slightly as if trying to sound reasonable. "I didn't mean any disrespect. Just doing my job, making sure everything's on the up and up. You know how it is." The man's gaze flicked back to him, and something in Reynolds' face changed. It was subtle, but Marcus saw it, a crack in the confidence, a moment of doubt. "Do I?" the man asked simply. Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it again. He seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. The elderly woman adjusted her grip on the diaper package. "I'd like to pay for this now." Her voice was even, unshaken. Marcus snapped into motion, punching a few buttons on the register, the beep breaking the tension momentarily. "That'll be..." Before he could finish, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "I got it." The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not necessary." He gave her a small, knowing smile. "I know." For a moment it looked like she might refuse, but then she let out a quiet breath. A moment passed. Between them, respect, understanding, something deeper than words. Reynolds shifted again, clearly realizing that the situation was slipping further and further out of his control. "All right," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Well, no harm done, right?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed Marcus a few crisp bills and waited for the receipt. The elderly woman took the bagged diapers carefully, nodding once to Marcus in thanks. Then she turned back to Reynolds. "You asked me earlier if I knew who you were," she said. Reynolds blinked, caught off guard. "What?" She tilted her head slightly. "You assumed I was just another old lady with nowhere to be. Someone who needed to be watched, questioned, doubted?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but she continued before he could interrupt. "But the real question is, do you know who you are?" Silence. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Marcus felt his breath catch. He knew what she was asking, what she was really asking, because it wasn't just about the way Reynolds had treated her. It was about what that treatment revealed. Reynolds didn't respond. Maybe he didn't have an answer. The man who had paid for the diapers stepped forward then, looking at Reynolds with an expression that was unreadable. "Be careful," he said quietly. "You never know who you're talking to." With that, he turned, giving the elderly woman a slight nod before walking her toward the door. Reynolds stood there, frozen in place, as the two of them left the store. Marcus watched them go, his heart still beating a little too fast. He glanced at Reynolds, who looked as if he was still processing what had just happened. The store employees went back to work, the customers slowly returning to their business, but the energy in the air had shifted. Reynolds had come into the store certain of who he was, certain of the world as he saw it, but now he wasn't so sure. Reynolds' throat bobbed as he swallowed. His silence spoke volumes. The man took a slow step closer. "You didn't, did you?" He let the question hang for a beat before continuing. "But you should have." Reynolds exhaled sharply, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, The man didn't let him finish. "That woman," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, "is one of the last surviving members of the Freedom Riders." The air in the store seemed to freeze. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The Freedom Riders. He had learned about them in school, had read about how they risked their lives traveling through the South fighting for civil rights. He had seen grainy old photos of buses set on fire, of young men and women being dragged away by officers who looked an awful lot like Reynolds. And the elderly woman, the woman Reynolds had mocked, had questioned, had treated like she was nothing, had been there. The realization hit like a punch. Reynolds' face paled. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. The man in the suit continued. "She has spent her life fighting for justice, for dignity. She has faced men with more power than you, more hate than you, and she has never backed down." His voice remained steady, but there was something in it now, a quiet force that carried through the store. "And tonight, after everything she has lived through, you, a man who should know better, stood there and treated her like a criminal." Reynolds's hands curled into fists at his sides. His face was tight, like he was trying to hold on to whatever authority he had left. But it was slipping. Marcus could see it. Everyone in the store could see it. And then, just when it felt like the weight of the moment couldn't get any heavier, the automatic doors slid open again. A collective breath seemed to be held as the elderly woman stepped back inside. She moved slowly, her cane tapping against the tile floor, her posture just as straight as before. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked two other people, both older, both carrying an air of quiet strength. One was a man with a lined face and sharp, steady eyes. The other, a woman with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. They didn't need to say a word. Their presence alone shifted everything. Reynolds' eyes darted between them, his breathing shallow now. He recognized them. He knew who they were. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a late-night shopping trip. It wasn't just about a single moment of arrogance, a single act of disrespect. This was something much bigger, something that had just caught up to him. The store felt smaller now, like the walls had closed in around Reynolds. He wasn't just facing one woman anymore. He was facing history itself. The elderly woman stopped a few feet from him, her sharp eyes searching his face. The two people behind her stood like pillars, their presence heavy with meaning. The man in the suit took a step back, as if he knew this wasn't his moment to speak. For a long time, she said nothing. She let the silence do the work, let it settle over Reynolds like a weight he couldn't shake off. Then, finally, she spoke. "Do you know how many times I've had a man like you stand in front of me and tell me I didn't belong?" Reynolds blinked. His throat worked, but no words came. "I was younger than you the first time I was arrested," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "Do you know what for?" No answer. He wasn't sure if he could speak, even if he wanted to. "For sitting," she said simply. "For sitting where I wasn't supposed to sit." Marcus felt his hands tighten around the edge of the counter. The weight of her words pressed down on the entire store, on everyone who was still watching. The woman took another step closer. "I have seen men with badges do far worse than what you did tonight. And do you know what scares me the most?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "That after all these years, after all the blood spilled, after all the lives lost, you still don't understand what you've done." Reynolds' jaw tensed. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were full of something Marcus couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, or was it something else? "I wasn't trying to..." Reynolds started, but she raised a hand. Not in anger, not in aggression, just enough to silence him. "This isn't about what you meant to do," she said. "It's about what you did." Another beat of silence, then the man in the suit finally spoke again. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice measured. "Do you know who I am?" Reynolds turned to him slowly, like the weight of the room was dragging him down. He exhaled, like he already knew the answer. "Yeah," he muttered. "I do." Marcus glanced between them, trying to piece it together. The tension in Reynolds' shoulders, the hesitation in his voice, it was clear now. This man wasn't just some random figure stepping in. He was someone with power, someone who could change the course of Reynolds' future with a single phone call. Officer Reynolds stood still, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He wasn't used to feeling this way, off balance, uncertain. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but he couldn't quite grasp why. The elderly woman's words echoed in his mind, looping back over and over. "Do you know who you are?" The store had returned to normal, at least on the surface. Customers were scanning their items, employees were stocking shelves, and the soft hum of background music filled the air. But Marcus could tell nothing felt the same. Not to Reynolds. He could see it in the way the officer's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the entrance as if expecting the woman and the man who had accompanied her to come back. But they were gone. The moment had passed, yet the unease lingered. Marcus turned back to his register, but his hands were shaking slightly as he folded the bills and slid them into the drawer. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen power misused, words twisted to control, to belittle. But tonight something had shifted, and he wasn't the only one who noticed. The young woman with the shopping basket, who had been watching from the start, suddenly spoke. Her voice was low but firm. "You don't even realize what just happened, do you?" Reynolds turned toward her, his expression darkening. "Excuse me?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. She didn't have to say it outright, neither did he, but you felt it. That's why you're still standing here, trying to figure out why you suddenly don't feel as big as you did 5 minutes ago. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His authority, the thing he relied on so easily, wasn't working the way it usually did. Marcus glanced toward the store entrance again, half expecting to see the man return. He still didn't know exactly who he was, but he had a feeling Reynolds did, or at least he was starting to. The silence stretched. Then, with a forced laugh, Reynolds rolled his shoulders back, as if shaking off an invisible weight. "Look, I don't need a lecture. I was doing my job." The young woman scoffed, shifting her basket in her arms. "Your job? What exactly do you think your job is?" Reynolds turned away from her, his frustration evident, but he didn't leave. It was like something was keeping him there, keeping him locked in place. Marcus, still behind the register, hesitated before speaking. His voice was quieter than the others, but steady. "You didn't just underestimate her." He swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "So you disrespected her. You treated her like she didn't belong." Reynolds let out a breath, but it wasn't quite a sigh. It was something else. Maybe frustration, maybe something deeper. "She's nobody special," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus felt something stir inside him. He knew that wasn't true. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for that exact moment, the automatic doors slid open again. Everyone turned, and in stepped another man, this one wearing a suit. He walked with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning the store the moment he entered. His presence was different from the first man's. He carried himself with authority, but it wasn't forced. It was natural, the kind that came from experience, from command. Reynolds stiffened the second he saw him. The man's eyes landed on the officer, and the look he gave him was one of quiet recognition. Reynolds muttered something under his breath. Straightening his stance, Marcus watched the exchange, his heart hammering in his chest. The man in the suit took a step forward, and then another, and with each step, the tension in the store thickened. No one spoke. No one moved, because whatever was about to happen was going to change everything. The man in the suit stopped just a few feet away from Reynolds, his expression unreadable, his gaze, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the officer, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the store, already thick, felt like it had reached an unbearable level. Marcus could feel it pressing down on his chest. Then, finally, the man broke the silence. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice even but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. Reynolds's posture stiffened even more. He clearly knew this man, knew him well enough to realize this wasn't just some random customer walking in off the street. His jaw tightened, but he gave a short nod. "Sir." The man studied him for a moment, then let his eyes flick toward Marcus, toward the young woman still standing with her shopping basket, and finally toward the door where the elderly woman had left just minutes before. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a knowing look, an understanding that stretched beyond what had been said out loud. He turned his attention back to Reynolds. "Tell me something," he said, his voice still, calm, but there was something behind it now, a quiet intensity. "Did you know who that woman was?" The man nodded, as if confirming what Reynolds was already thinking. "Then you know this doesn't end here." Reynolds' hands flexed at his sides, his breathing unsteady. His authority had drained from him, slipping through his fingers like sand. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The elderly woman watched him for a long moment before finally giving a slow nod, as if deciding something in her mind. Then, with a quiet but firm voice, she said, "Go home, officer." Reynolds' eyes widened slightly. "What?" "You heard me," she said. "Go home." He didn't move. He didn't know if he should. The man in the suit watched him carefully. "Consider this your chance to do better." Reynolds swallowed. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him harder than ever. Finally, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one needed to. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him, but he barely felt it. He kept walking, his mind racing, his heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know who he was, and that terrified him. Back inside, the elderly woman watched him go, then turned back to Marcus. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Thank you for standing your ground," she said softly. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded. "Anytime." She glanced down at the bag of diapers still in her hand, then chuckled lightly. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" Marcus didn't have the words to respond, because somehow he knew this night, this moment, was something none of them would ever forget. The automatic doors slid shut behind Reynolds, and just like that, he was gone. The tension in the store, though still lingering, began to ease. People who had been frozen in place slowly started to move again. A murmur of voices returned, carts rolled along the aisles, and for a moment it felt like everything was slipping back into normalcy. But Marcus knew it wasn't the same. Nothing about this night had been ordinary. The elderly woman let out a soft sigh, adjusting the bag in her hand. The other two people who had come in with her exchanged a knowing glance, and without needing to say much, they all seemed to understand that their presence had made the statement it needed to. Marcus finally found his voice. "Would you like me to help carry that out to your car?" She turned to him, her eyes warm. "I think I've carried more in my lifetime than a bag of diapers, young man." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, but then his face grew serious. He hesitated, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. "I just want to say I'm sorry that you had to deal with that tonight, that you still have to deal with it after everything you've already fought for." The woman studied him for a moment, then smiled gently. "Son, if an apology could erase history, I would have been free a long time ago." She reached out, patting his hand lightly. "But what matters isn't what's behind us, it's what we do next." Marcus nodded, letting her words settle. He had never thought about it that way before. The man in the suit, who had remained quiet after Reynolds left, finally spoke again. "I'll be making sure this situation is properly addressed," he said, his tone professional but firm. "Officer, Reynolds will have to face the consequences of his choices." Marcus believed him. Whoever this man was, he clearly had the power to make sure Reynolds didn't just walk away from this night unchanged. But at the same time, Marcus found himself wondering, would it really make a difference? Would someone like Reynolds ever truly see what had just happened? The young woman who had spoken up earlier finally set her shopping basket on the counter. She looked at Marcus, then back at the elderly woman. "You were amazing," she said, her voice full of admiration. "I mean, I didn't even know who you were at first, but the way you handled all of that, it was powerful. The woman chuckled softly. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand in the truth. It shakes people more than shouting ever will. The young woman nodded, looking like she was going to remember those words for a long time. Marcus finished scanning her items, bagging them carefully. The store felt quieter now, not in an empty way, but in a thoughtful way, like something important had happened here, and no one would walk away from it the same. As the elderly woman and her companions prepared to leave, Marcus found himself speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" She paused, turning back to him. "Of course." "What made you come back in?" he asked. "I mean, you could have left. You didn't have to come back." Her expression softened. "I wanted to see," she said simply, "if he would stand in his mistake or if he would run from it." Marcus swallowed. "And what do you think?" She thought about it for a moment, then smiled sadly. "Men like him don't run, but that doesn't mean they don't hide." Marcus wasn't sure what to say to that. He had a feeling he'd be thinking about those words for a long time. As she turned to leave, she stopped once more and looked at him with kind eyes. "Keep standing, young man. The world needs more people like you." And then she was gone. Marcus stood there for a long time after she left, the words replaying in his mind. He had never seen himself as someone who could make a difference. He was just a cashier, just a guy working late nights to get by. But tonight had felt different. Maybe standing up, even in the smallest moments, was how change really started. As he turned back to his register, the store continuing on as if nothing had happened, he realized something. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had.